Good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, resources that we hope will help improve your life. I'm Stu Reed, and here's my co-host, Dave Bernstein.
Hello.
How
You
you
want the
doing,
good
Dave?
news or the bad news
Let's
first?
start with some good news. What's going on?
Well, good news, there's one remarkable story this week. As we've reported before, Apple is letting you send text messages via satellite from just about anywhere, ultimately, although it isn't working much outside the US, I believe, so far. And one of those places is in the wilds of Alaska where somebody got lost.
Hmm.
Sent a message up to the satellite, and rescuers found him and rescued him.
Wow.
That's a really good news that works. I looked for the show 2 weeks ago at what's happening with satellites and phones. It will definitely be possible to make calls from your ordinary cell phone, certain models. It's probably 2 to 5 years before that's a commercial service available.
Hmm.
But sending text via satellite is working already and actually
Wow.
saving your life.
So,
The
so
other
the,
good
the
tech,
lost guy sent a text, Dave. Was it just an emergency text? How do you even know how to contact when you're out in the wilderness in the middle of nowhere? Is that a 911 or how does that work?
it goes to the local emergency services, which I
Okay.
assume normally is 911.
Hmm.
It comes back to you with text with a few questions for them, like what kind of help do you need, and so on.
Hmm.
And it worked, which
Excellent.
is good.
Yeah.
The other good technology news is that the mRNA vaccines that were the first to work against COVID, there are now about 8 vaccines on the market, are also working against flu. Flu
Hmm.
vaccines have been god awful for as long as I can remember. Every year they say it worked for 40% of the population. The vaccine helped,
Hmm.
which is not nearly enough. And it looks like they're going to be able to use the mRNA vaccine possibly as soon as next year to go against most of the variants that are out there. That's the good news.
So, Dave, is that a combination COVID and flu vaccine?
No, it isn't, although they're working on that. It is probably going to be possible to go in one day and get one vaccine in your left arm and the other in your right arm.
Mm.
There are some symptoms sometimes. My arm was very tender after my COVID vaccine, but none of them are serious very often at all.
Hmm.
So they're working with things like that.
Hmm. Okay.
Okay, now you had a few stories you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, well, interesting. Pew Research, they're Pew Research Center. They do a lot of stuff, research on technology, and have been doing so for many years. They just did a survey of 19 advanced countries, where they asked folks about social media. And interestingly, there was a bit of a skew between the US results and other countries. In the US, actually nearly two-thirds, 64% of respondents view social media as a bad thing for democracy, well above the survey's median, which was 35%. And that's kind of a big differential, 64% versus 35 for everybody else.
Well, most of the other countries don't have Donald Trump.
There you go. You took the words out of my mouth, Dave. The last 5 years in this country really just kind of, I think, skewed all of our perception of social media and just how negative it could be. Um, I'm reading from the results further. It says over two-thirds of the folks in the US said the internet and social media have made people more divided in political opinions and, quote, less civil in the way they talk about politics. And again, American percentages were higher than the median for all the other countries. And I think you're absolutely right. It's been a our history with Donald Trump over the last 5 years. I guess since 2016 when he was elected, actually leading up to the election.
Have
In
they sent him to
2016.
jail yet?
What's that?
Have they sent him to jail yet?
Yeah, not yet. We hear and at least on my end hope that there are going to be some indictments coming soon. That's what the scuttlebutt says, but we will see. I mean, it's going to be such a ground breaking thing for that to happen. And part of my paranoia, Dave, I'd like to get your opinion on this, is that locking him up would make a martyr of him among those on the far right, and could empower them even further. That's just my concern. I don't think we should not lock him up because of that, but that's my paranoid concern. What's your take on that?
Well, martyrs are very powerful. Jesus Christ,
Mm-hmm.
starting there. And it probably is not politically helpful to make Donald Trump into a martyr. It's very hard to feel that a billionaire with mansions and towers and golf courses and many other things is suffering.
Mm-hmm.
But he thinks so.
Yeah.
And there's some people who agree with him. The interesting one who wasn't allowed to become a martyr, this was US policy, was Osama bin Laden.
Mm-hmm.
When we went after him, we grabbed his body and dumped it at sea to prevent them building a shrine to him, as the Muslims tend to do with people they think are holy men. And there are many Muslims who think he was a holy man, partially because, with American help, he was involved in getting the Russians out of Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. So, Dave, you're saying because his body was not retrieved, that inhibited somehow the reaction of the Muslim world in terms of creating the martyrdom mystique around him?
Well, that's what the newspapers were saying at the time, and why we dumped the body and didn't let his family bury him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, going back to Greek tragedies, not letting a family bury is a very ugly thing and a very sensitive thing. But we didn't hesitate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, social media. We've talked about that so much on the show. It's not going anywhere. It's just getting bigger. Just kind of following up on that story of the survey by Pew. We know that the hate speech has continued to rise on Twitter since Elon Musk took it over, and I know we talked last week, and I don't want to beat this horse too much, but we did talk last week about Mastodon, a potential alternative platform for social media, Twitter type discourse. Even though we're talking about a couple million versus 100 million users, you pointed out that no matter who's at the helm of Twitter and how dysfunctional the managers may be, the platform is going to continue to work, and people are going to continue to use it, irrespective of mismanagement and financial travails that they may be going through.
Mastodon's an interesting alternative,
Mm-hmm.
and there's some software out there, I haven't tried it myself, that allows you to take your Twitter followers and bring them to Mastodon with you. That's something that Facebook doesn't allow, as Facebook is trying to create barriers. They're trying to fragment the internet into Facebook and everything else. And for a lot of people, they've been succeeding.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The New York Times story again said that in Asia, a lot of people don't realize that Facebook isn't the whole internet,
Mm-hmm.
because it's so dominant in Southern Asia.
Mm-hmm. I flash back, Dave, and you certainly were around at the time and closer to this probably than I was when the internet was really kind of new in this country. AOL had a stranglehold, much like Facebook does in some of these countries. And they created what was called at the time a walled garden, where they tried to have all the different sites that they thought people should go to within their purview. And a lot of folks thought once you were on AOL, you were on the internet, when in fact they created their own ecosystem and kept you inside of that, and you were not out on the larger internet. And they were able to
They
maintain that for
eventually
a
let
while.
you on. They eventually let you onto the internet because
Mhm.
they didn't have any choice in the matter. And then when they went unlimited time, blew out their system and blew out everything. This would have been in the early 90s. 23 years ago, a lot of people were very scared that AOL would dominate totally. Where is AOL today? Where's it been the last 15 years?
That's a good question.
So that we're seeing this enormous domination, network effects that really make it difficult for new companies to have a place, but it's not a guarantee.
Mm-hmm.
TikTok is beating out Facebook in a lot of markets, I think, including the US. You had another story there about TikTok.
Yeah, a number of states, Maryland in particular, just banned TikTok on any state devices. Uh, their concern is not about the content that's on there, which a lot of other folks have concerns about, but it's about the security and the data gathering that the Chinese government or their agents or folks acting on their behalf are doing on the TikTok platform. And
There's very little evidence that anything significant has happened. There have been a few very minor incidents, but that's all. And presumably, the Chinese are not doing nearly as much as the United States does on everybody around the world on the Facebook platform.
Well, is this a knee-jerk reaction? What's going on, Dave? I mean, South Dakota,
Oh, this is
South
real
Carolina.
There's a whole lot of hatred of China going on.
Mm-hmm.
Trump, in particular, tried to make them into the bogeyman.
Mm-hmm.
China was generally viewed favorably 8 and 10 years ago in polls. That's totally reversed now. So what we see is the governor of Maryland knows that China's unpopular, attack him, and that'll help him get reelected. That's just what it is. It's a cheap stunt because there never was that much TikTok on state computers. Just a way to make noise.
Interesting. So
now, Facebook, while we're on that subject, is really hurting. The stock is down by 3/4 and so on. But did you see what's happening in Europe?
No, what's going on there?
Well, they may declare Facebook's entire business model totally illegal.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep. It's gone to the highest court in Europe. The decision hasn't been announced, but it was very wildly leaked. Europe has rules called the GDPR, which eliminates what companies can do to your privacy.
Mm-hmm.
It apparently has ruled that Facebook cannot surveil you without your agreeing to it directly, not something buried in a long document, for each use that Facebook might have to the surveillance information.
What, each use?
Yeah, and Cory Doctorow, in fact, said, 700 different applications? And you have to first get the permission to surveil, and then you have to get the permission to use the surveil. That's 1,400 permissions people would have to give Facebook. And as he pointed out, when Apple allowed you to opt out of all surveillance, over 90% of the people opted out. Nobody likes surveillance. Nobody in Europe likes the fact it's the Americans surveilling them, and there's a lot of people in Europe who think it wasn't right for the United States to tap the phone of the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, and many other people like that. This is apparently coming down. It's pretty serious, and it really will affect Facebook's business model.
Now, explain that for our listeners, Dave. Why wouldn't Facebook simply opt out of collecting the surveillance data? And clearly, you're saying that impacts their business. What's the linkage there?
Uh, well, the reality of the linkage was actually disputed by Corey, who cited some theory. Everybody in advertising believes that the ability of Facebook to target because they know a whole lot about you, whether or not you're pregnant is something. You can target pregnant women on Facebook, which came up, and we had it on the show a while back, when a lady didn't know she was pregnant, but some of her purchases suggested to Facebook she was pregnant, and she started getting ads for baby diapers. And the pregnancy test proved positive. There's a lot of people who don't think that's appropriate. I'm going to be starting on insulin tonight. My diabetes needs it. It's the right thing. And I'm not going to try to hide it. But a whole lot of people wouldn't want that known. I'm not going out for a job now. But if I were, I would not want all my medical history to be available to Facebook and people who get it from Facebook. So this is a good issue. Corey pointed out, however, that why Facebook and Google, who've been claiming that because they can target the advertising so well, it works so much better, and that's why they can charge so much. Corey pointed to data that said, if you just look at what the page is about, that can give you a pretty good idea of who's going to read it and targets just about as effectively. I haven't looked at the original data on this, so I can't tell you one way or the other, but these are real issues. And TikTok knocking out Facebook is almost unbelievable. Now, what's the top fast fashion company in the United States right now? I bet you don't know this one.
I wouldn't have a clue, Dave.
Yeah. So you think of it as H&M and Zara, which have all the stores with the cheap fast fashion. Another Chinese outfit called Shein is getting all the teenage girls with incredible prices and incredible selection of cheap, fashionable clothes, with something like 4,000 items becoming available each month.
Wow.
They have an army of designers in China working with an army of factories, cranking out whatever looks to be hot. And the existing Zara's and H&M's can't go quite that fast. And so Shein has done remarkably well. It's a private company, so we don't know the value. It's claiming to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars, i.e., the kind of value Facebook has. What's going to happen there? I don't know. But if you want really cheap clothes, Shein has a lot of it.
Well, so they've got the
cheap
pricing
is probably a description as well as a price.
Pricing and production output sounds like is what's driving it.
Yeah, whereas on the other hand, a lot of manufacturing is now leaving China for wonderful reasons. Apple, in fact, is going to be doing more manufacturing in Vietnam and in India. Because in China, in the last 15 years, wages have gone up, average city employee, 10 times.
Whoa.
So China is no longer
good for them.
Cheap labor.
Wow.
Mexico claims it's cheaper to manufacture in Mexico than in China, for example. And it's certainly cheaper in India if you can do it efficiently. There's lots of problems with all of Indian industry. Where do most Samsung phones come from? This one I bet you also won't guess.
Yes, not Korea?
Not Korea. $10 billion plants they've been building in Vietnam. Because wages there are much lower than in Korea.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. So most of what we know about this kind of thing turns out not to be true.
Mm-hmm.
It's really amazing when you get to the facts how much misinformation there is, and it's not all coming from conservative blowhards.
Mm-hmm.
Not that they are pretty good at putting out misinformation.
Now, before we get off the topic of Facebook, there's a story that came out that Facebook is considering removing news from their platform because there's some pending legislation. I think it's federal legislation, the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, that would allow news companies to collectively negotiate with social media platforms for the material that appears on their site. That is, negotiate for payment. Is that going to go anywhere? Do you think that has legs there?
Well, Harold Feld, a friend of mine, who's a key public advocate in Washington, put together 25 organizations, including things like EFF and the ACLU, to oppose it. And it apparently, according to a news story, was killed a few hours ago by the leaders in Congress. And they said because of all the public opposition and Facebook's opposition to paying, Europe actually has some laws in Germany. Australia has a law that they have to pay news organizations. Why do they have to pay news organizations? Well, in Australia in particular, the news is dominated by Rupert Murdoch.
Mm.
His daddy in Australia built his fortune over there,
Mm-hmm.
and they still own most of the major papers and a major broadcast. So if you want to be the next premier or prime minister or president or whatever they call it in Australia, you don't want to get all those newspapers and TV stations tearing you apart. So you go along with what Rupert Murdoch wants almost all the time. And to get some money from Facebook and Google and so on, Rupert Murdoch will be very happy to.
Mm-hmm.
So that's happening. But the one in the US, according to a news story in the last few hours, is being blocked in Congress, which is good news. Now, who gets the money if it goes to predominantly local newspapers and TV stations?
Probably
Turns out
the big chains, right?
some to the big chains, but the big chains like Tribune Broadcasting are all owned by, and Gannett, are all owned by venture capital firms who came in, fired three-quarters of the news staff, have minimal reporting, and because people still want the local paper, a lot of them, they don't all give up their subscription, uh, have been making a lot of money off papers like that.
Mm.
So the part of the argument in Washington is that we're not supporting journalism or local journalism. We're supporting a couple of rich guys in Greenwich.
Interesting.
Which is the hedge funds who actually have bought and owned most of the local papers.
Wow. Mm.
Mm. Yeah.
Okay, so we're about ready to take a break, Dave. But before we go, I've got to make a pitch to our audience. Since 2020, our broadcast board here at WACR has been malfunctioning, and we've been struggling to keep WACR on the air with uninterrupted programming. We appreciate those of you who have been bearing with us and turning back, and even though the station has been going off the air occasionally in the middle of your favorite show. We apologize for this and assure you that we're trying to resolve the options, to solve the problem with various options. You may have heard your favorite DJ or talk show host asking for support, and that's why we are now asking to help us raise $40,000 to buy a new broadcast board. That's the broadcast or audio board, where we switch all the audio and controls all the audio that goes out over the air. We need $40,000 to get a new board. If you'd like to help us with this, we'd like you to, there one of a couple ways. You can send me an email at stureed@live.com. And we have a program going on with something called Double Good Popcorn, where you can buy this incredibly good popcorn and half the money is donated. Yeah, it's really cool. Double
Sounds
Good.
like Girl Scout cookies.
It's something like that. Send me an email and I'll give you a link to show you how to do that. My email is stureid, STUREID @live.com. Or you can send an email, send a donation directly to the radio station. Care of our show, Community and Technology at WHCR at CCNY, 160 Convent Avenue, NAC 1/513, New York, 10031. Or the more modern way, simply go online to WHCR.org, click on the contribution and make a donation. And please put the name of our show, Community and Technology, in the comments section. And we want to thank you for supporting not just our show, but WHCR Community Radio 90.3. So we're going to take a brief musical break, Dave, and be back in a few minutes. Thanks for tuning in and staying connected with the voice of Harlem. Be right back.
Winter nights, twinkling lights, and snowflakes falling to the ground. The air is filled with Christmas. Santa's sleigh, kids at play. It's that magic time of year when love is all around us, and that magic seems to reach right out and touch me again, just like the years before. It's Christmas in my heart. Seems the time stands still for Christmas. It's time for laughter and cheer. A time for giving to others. It's sharing our love for those we hold so dear. Too soon the season's over. As I face the new year, this wish I make on every star, may it be Christmas, always Christmas in my heart. It seemed that time stands still for Christmas. It's time for laughter and cheer. A time for giving to others. It's sharing our love with those we hold so dear. Too soon the season's over. And as I face the new year, this wish I make on every star, may it be Christmas, Christmas in my heart. Oh, it's just Christmas in my heart. Have a good time.
Okay, we're back. Community and Technology with Dave Burstein and Stu Reed on WHCR 90.3. We've been talking about what's going on in technology and Facebook in particular. And there's a story, Dave, about the South Korean mobile carrier SK Telecom that relates to that. Tell us about that.
Okay, Facebook renamed itself Meta because Mark Zuckerberg thought everything will turn into the metaverse and he'd better own it. He's not going to. The world is not going to let him do it. So one of the latest things is that the Koreans and the Japanese, giant companies there, SK, the largest mobile phone carrier in Korea, NTT, one of the largest mobile phone companies in the world, and landlines in Japan are getting together. They're bringing in Singtel, and they're all doing this to create a metaverse that will be open and Asian. Several of the officials at the European Commission have said, in so many words, no one is going to own the metaverse. Certainly not Facebook. So that is hopeful. Facebook itself has said all the right things about how it'll be open. But Facebook's history is being very closed. If I left Facebook, I can't take my 600 friends with me.
Mm-hmm.
Twitter, I can go to Mastodon, and there is some software that lets you take your subscribers. No way can I do that at Facebook. And Facebook, having the closed circuit, trying to put up barriers, trying to fragment the internet, is a big issue. And everybody else in the world, the Chinese most decisively, but also the Indians, the Koreans, the Japanese, the Europeans, and ultimately the Africans and Latin Americans, although they haven't raised too much noise about this so far. That's a good thing. Nobody should own the internet.
So all those
Facebook
folks you
and
just
Google
mentioned
have too much
are
fun.
looking at an open architecture, Dave. Is that what you're saying? Open metaverse architecture?
All different plans, because nobody knows what this metaverse is going to be, or even whether it's going to be. A lot of people aren't sure because people hate wearing goggles. And it's not clear it makes that much difference. We've got the goggles. Jenny enjoys playing in VR. There's definitely some value in games. Whether it turns out that, for example, I'm going to have to do tomorrow morning a Zoom with a medical person to go over some of my history and some of my claims. Will that be so much more effective with 3D that I'm going to want to wear goggles and insist they wear goggles? I don't know. You don't know. So it's hard. So nobody knows how this is going to play out, but fighting to keep it open certainly seems a good cause.
Absolutely. And just to put in perspective, I know we talked last week or the week before about just how far off this is. I know you talked about how the networks are nowhere near fast enough in terms of the latency, which is the response time for the metaverse to really work like folks are talking about. What's your sense? How far away are we from this thing actually working like folks are dreaming about?
I was at one of these fancy events. This was the Brooklyn 6G, which is giving the future of wireless. And the organizer said the metaverse is going to be a big thing, and brought in heavy-duty people from places like Microsoft, AT&T, Qualcomm, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And they all talked about the incredible things you're going to be able to do. But this was the wireless event. So that the narrator or the host of the day looked at the Microsoft lady and said, how fast does it have to be to do that? And she said, I can't tell you. They told me not to talk about it. I'll tell you offline. But I caught her offline a little later, and she said, I really can't talk about it because what's going on there is that 5G is not very fast. 5G, like 4G, in theory, can be very fast, very quick. 10 milliseconds latency, 1 millisecond latency. No one in the world is building networks like that. The actual latency on Verizon, they specify on their edge network that's supposed to be fast, and they say it has very low latency, 20 to 35 milliseconds. Guess what? The average latency on Verizon 4G is 32 milliseconds. Just about the same. So that why they talk about this low latency tactile internet, that's 5 or 10 or 15 years away in most of the world. And most of the fabulous things they're talking about doing with the metaverse aren't going to work on the actual networks the phone companies are building.
Interesting.
Yeah, nobody knows that. Verizon has been throwing money at all the VR people and saying, this is what we're going to deliver. And they had been talking about getting down. You have to get down to about 10 milliseconds or a lot of people's stomach goes somewhere. At 20 milliseconds, a lot of people get dizzy and nauseous in VR. And that's just the fact of life. And so you have to get it down towards 10. And Verizon intended 3 years ago to build the network for 10 milliseconds. It would have taken several thousand local servers around the United States. And they decided that was too expensive. They put in about 24 servers, one for the whole Boston area, for example. To get down to 10 milliseconds, they'd have to put out 50 in Boston, something like that. Certainly 24. And they decided that nobody really cared enough about it to pay for it. So they stopped building it.
Wow.
Next story.
Hype. That's what I'm hearing. Okay, so what else is going on? What else we got, Dave? Let me see.
Well, the Mastodon, which I put in there, in the article I sent over to you, is what is Mastodon and why are people leaving Twitter for it? We talked about that some last week. Since then, I've learned something quite important, which is that there is software that lets you bring your Twitter followers over with you. Of course, most of those people aren't going to be on Mastodon anytime soon, so it's not going to be a slam dunk, but an awful lot of the most interesting people on Twitter have signed up on Mastodon and are putting their things over Mastodon as well. And there's about 4 or 5 other alternatives to Twitter that are out there and working. Unfortunately, not one is as well designed and easy to use and as effective as Twitter. So it's not a simple decision, but it's happening, and you definitely have the choice. Okay. Next, let's get away from Twitter and Mastodon because everybody's talking about it.
You referenced a story about misinformation and doctors are right of free speech. What was that about, Dave? 2 lawsuits in California that challenging a new law that would punish doctors for spreading misleading information about COVID-19. That sounds like a pretty slippery slope.
This is a rough one, and yeah, it's a slippery slope, and it's really tricky. We have something called the First Amendment in the United States, which gives you the right to say almost anything except screaming fire in a crowded theater,
Mhm.
or making actual death threats and the like. Uh, that is the US Constitution. And every 10 years or so, somebody takes the wording of the First Amendment and does a survey out there and asks people whether they support it or not. And 2/3 of the people do not support the First Amendment if that when it's read to them. But that is the principle. Now, there are some doctors in California who think that COVID is mostly a hoax, that what you're told about the treatment is nonsense. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal, nominally a reliable publication, saying that if you don't want to get COVID, forget about the vaccines. They have lots of problems and don't work very well. And the best way to avoid COVID is to get healthy, exercise, and so on. That is utter and total nonsense, according to 98, 99% of the medical people who've looked at these questions. But does the 1% have the right to say, no, we think ivermectin is going to cure COVID? And there's this survey that had 14 people who did fairly well on their COVID after taking ivermectin. So that proves that that's what you should be doing.
Mhm.
Now, can California say you can't say that? Definite First Amendment right. Can California say that if you're a doctor saying this, you're breaking professional ethics? Well, that's the law that passed in California, and that's the one that's being challenged in court. It's very hard to know. I mean, once upon a time, everybody thought the sun revolved around the earth. Galileo was fortunately had some very powerful friends. Otherwise, he was going to be burned at the stake, and he actually was under house arrest in the last few years for saying, but it moves. I don't know if that's a true story or apocryphal, that he was under house arrest and gone after by the Inquisition is true and historical. But under his breath, he said, but it moves. I don't know if that's actually true. And there's been many, many times where every scientist, every doctor, I mean, did George Washington die because his doctor believed in bloodletting? Quite possibly. Oh, lots of people died because of that one. And it was absolutely the standard medical practice 200 years ago. And somebody speaking against it could have been attacked as being unethical and going against the canons of the profession and so on. So that one's in court in California. I think we've put the issues on the table. And that's the kind of issue that we're going to have again and again and again.
Yeah, that one's not going away. Not going away.
Now, yeah. So the article that I took it from was, is spreading medical misinformation a doctor's free speech right? Well, I don't know. I mean, who killed Kennedy? What do you know about who killed JFK? Stu, what did you?
I'm not sure I want to say on the air, Dave, but I certainly don't believe it was. I can't even remember the guy's name. The guy that
Lee Harvey Oswald.
Lee Harvey, yeah, it was not Lee Harvey Oswald. You know, I saw a documentary, David, just a little bit of sidebar, but on the History Channel, documentary called "The Men Who Killed Kennedy," and this documentary had names and photos of 3 or 4 guys that came from Italy that were imported in, working for certain government powers in the U.S. that were hired to do this hit, and then went back to Italy. I mean, it's you dig into it. I mean, it's kind of disgusting and kind of ugly. and there's so much misinformation out there. I guess that's where you're going. There's so many different storylines about what really happened. I certainly don't believe the Lee Harvey Oswald and the single bullet theory. I mean, that was ridiculous, and there's so much evidence to the contrary. But you know,
I'm inclined to believe that it was Lee Harvey Oswald,
yeah.
but it certainly has not been proven to everybody's satisfaction. My old friend Bob Fast did the overnights on BAI, and his favorite guest was Mae Brussell, giving the truth about the Kennedy assassination. And she was on the air again and again, and that's a right under free speech. So it's hard to know. Almost nobody believed Albert Einstein when he said Newton was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In fact, Einstein's work happened 1903 to 1905. 1905 was the Great Miracle Year. And when he came up with the theory of relativity and several other things. He didn't become world famous at that point.
Wasn't it dependent on some eclipse that had to happen before it got demonstrated that he was correct?
Einstein said that when you're near something big like a star, it affects the passage of light. And in 1919, Sir Arthur Eddington went to the southern hemisphere during a solar eclipse and discovered that, in fact, light was not coming from stars, a faraway star past our sun, where we expected to do it. And that was the conclusive proof that Einstein had it. And he was right. And it's been proved in many ways since, although there are deep questions about some things.
And that was front page headlines at the time, Dave, if I'm not mistaken, albeit 15 years after his theory came out.
Yeah. So there's definitely good reasons. I, right now, am in disagreement with 95, 98% of the people involved in our broadband funding, saying that the actual problem is that we're looking to fund millions of lines where people don't need them because they have perfectly good cable connections. And that it was a mistake in how they did the maps and how they wrote the rules that provided for billions and billions of dollars to upgrade people's homes who could get a very nice speed, definitely the 100 over down, 20 up that could go. And that's a decent speed. And in fact, I've been reporting for several years that nearly all cable in the United States, including all of Comcast, the largest carrier, is going to have close to a gigabit down and 100 megabits up in the next 3 years. Despite which fact, there are currently plans at NTIA to spend billions putting in fiber to replace that cable, even though the cable was perfectly fine for all practical purposes for many years. Now, how much are they spending on it? That's the other thing that should be out there. I wrote an article 9 months ago about how they were spending $30,000 a home past, may not even subscribe, in order to run some fiber up in Alaska. And since then, the Rural Utility Service has funded $200,000 per home passed. You can give somebody a brand new house in town for that and give them satellite internet that's decent, not great, but perfectly decent, for a lot less than 200,000. And you can give decent satellite to the 46 homes or whatever that they're spending so much money. It's 30,000 a home. So I'm right now knowing I'm in a minority of mostly good, well-meaning people who have been bamboozled, and since they think it's so good to get everybody the internet, don't want to face the fact that the way they're doing it is wasting tens of billions of federal dollars.
Well, Dave, my comment on that would be, Dave, much like the persecution of Galileo and Copernicus and other scientists that went against the tide of their current times. You can, but you face a lot of wrath when you push back against powered and moneyed interests. And I think that's what's going on with the whole broadband spend, is that it's a lot of folks in the industry, not consumers, but in the industry, are benefiting from this big spend. And it's hard to convince folks that something else is going on, because their voice is so large and their reach is so far. I'm reminded of a quote that one of my buddies, Doug Frazier, who's my technology buddy and a co-executive producer of this show. One of the quotes that he likes to use is talking about this kind of stuff is, "How I see it is how it is." And you think about that, and that's so true. Everybody's got their own perspective, and depending on how loud your voice is and how powerful your voice is, that kind of defines the reality.
How much time do we have left?
We're got a minute left, Dave.
Let me take that minute to say something to add on to what you did. We at WHCR need to raise $40,000 to replace our broadcast board. I've had some good luck lately. I'm going to kick in my $50 on that, and I hope you do. Come to WHCR.org or email us or send a letter or a note with a check. But HCR needs your help. I'm going to do my small bit of it as well.
Well, thank you, Dave, and so am I. Just going to remind our listeners and viewers, it's WHCR.org. Click on contribution and make a donation. Please mention Community and Technology, or you can email me, Stu Reed, STUREID @live.com. And I'll tell you about the Double Good popcorn sale, which is quite a nice deal. You get some excellent popcorn, freshly popped, and half the money goes to the station. Well, I think that's it, Dave, for today.
Okay. There's
Okay.
lots of news in our world, and we're doing our best to bring it to you.
Yes, we are. This has been Community and Technology with Dave Burstein and Stu Reed on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem, every Wednesday at 5 to 6 p.m. Stay tuned. Thanks for listening. Good night.